The bottle rolled across the floor half full, catching the light from the oil lamp. But his eyes didn't follow it. They followed her. The girl tried to back away, but the wall met her spine, cold and final. His grip came fast, the kind of grip that left no room for mercy. The dress her father forced her into tore from the shoulder down, the sound sharp enough to echo in her skull. He smiled like something had been paid, like she was the debt he was owed. Her father's gambling had finally caught up to him, and Evelyn became the cost. She didn't scream. Screaming was wasted in a house like his, buried under silence and dust. The kind of place where no one cared what happened behind locked doors. Some men wore fine boots and called themselves gentlemen, but the shine on their leather never hid the rot in their souls. That night, something was stolen from Evelyn, something she'd never get back. And somewhere deep inside her, a shadow began to grow, one that carried both grief and defiance. When dawn crept across the desert, another story began. Jonas heard it before he saw it, a sound at the door, faint, uncertain. Not a knock exactly, more like something fragile collapsing against the wood. He reached for the handle with one hand, the other wrapped tight around an old shotgun that hadn't been fired since '76. What stood before him wasn't danger, at least not in the way he'd known it. It was a girl, barefoot, blood on her neck, wrapped in a filthy bedsheet. Her eyes were hollow but alert, like an animal too tired to keep running. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't need to. Jonas took off his coat and handed it over. She hesitated like she didn't deserve it, then pulled it tight around herself. Her hands trembled, her voice steady but distant as she muttered that she wasn't clean. Jonas didn't flinch. He didn't judge. He just pointed her toward the tack room behind the house and let her walk ahead. She moved like her body could give out at any moment. Inside, he poured water, set a kettle to heat, and stayed quiet. He'd seen this kind of thing before, not the girl herself, but what made her. The type of men who used power like a weapon and believed the law was their leash to pull. Jonas had fought men like that before, in saloons, in war, in his own damn town. But something about this morning felt different. The trouble hadn't passed him by this time. It had come straight to his doorstep. As the sun broke over the Arizona plain, he sat on the porch, the shotgun leaning against the wall. Dust lifted in small spirals around his boots. He didn't know her name, didn't need to. Whoever she was, someone would come looking. And when they did, he hoped to God they came ready, because this time the wrong ranch had found their path. She hadn't been inside 10 minutes before the dogs started up. Not panicked, just alert. Jonas stepped out. The light was still low, the kind that made the land look half awake. Down the trail came a rider, kicking up a trail of dust, every hoofbeat measured and full of purpose. Jonas waited steady. The rider pulled up, big frame, scar down his cheek, gun worn smooth from use. His voice was low and sharp, asking about a blonde girl, barefoot, maybe wearing a sheet. Jonas squinted against the sun, his jaw tight. The man claimed she belonged to Mr. Glay, his wife, signed by paper and seal, and he was there to bring her home. Jonas didn't answer right away. He filled a bucket from the well, letting the water splash heavy on the dirt. When he spoke, his words were slow, carved from gravel. A scared girl running through cactus and stone doesn't need a home. She needs help. Bruises on bruises don't come from bad manners. They come from a coward with power. The man's eyes narrowed. He asked if Jonas really wanted to stand between Mr. Glay and his wife. Jonas met his gaze and didn't blink. He wasn't moving. Silence filled the space between them, the kind that hums before a storm breaks. But the man didn't draw. Instead, he smiled, the kind of smile that promised he'd be back with company. Then he turned his horse and rode off, leaving a thin line of dust in his wake. When Jonas stepped back into the tack room, the girl's eyes were open, watching him. Not scared now, just studying, as if trying to understand what kind of man he was. He set bread beside her and walked out. As he reached the porch, he took down the rifle he hadn't touched in years. Because men like Glay never sent one dog. They came back louder, meaner, and they didn't bother to knock. That day passed slow. Jonas worked in silence, the air heavy with waiting. The girl, Evelyn, though he didn't yet know her name, stayed inside. Barely moved, barely ate. Like she believed if she just stayed small enough, the world might forget her. He left food on the table by the door. Sometimes it disappeared, sometimes not. Every now and then, he caught her peeking out the window, searching for something she feared might still be chasing her. By midday, she stepped outside for the first time. The sun hit her face and made her squint, the coat still draped around her thin shoulders. Jonas was at the gate, fixing the hinges. He didn't look up right away, but he saw her standing there, hesitant but upright. She came closer, asked to help. He handed her a small hammer, watched her fumble with it, and told her she'd learn. It wasn't much, just nails, wood, and the creak of a gate that refused to stay quiet. But it was something new for her, something that didn't hurt. By the time they finished, a small smile threatened the edge of her mouth. That night, she sat near him under the porch roof, both watching the dust drift across the yard. When her voice broke the silence, it carried the question she'd been afraid to ask. She wanted to know if he thought they'd come back. Jonas didn't look at her when he answered. He just said he'd bet his last boot on it. She nodded like she already knew, but her hands weren't shaking anymore, and he noticed that. For the first time since she'd appeared at his door, her hands were steady. They came just before sundown. 3 riders, moving fast through the desert haze, their horses kicking up red dust that rolled across the horizon like thunderclouds. Jonas saw them long before they reached the yard. He didn't move. He didn't need to. The old rifle rested by the door, the air around him thick with silence. Inside, Evelyn watched from behind the curtain, the edge of the fabric trembling between her fingers. She knew who it was. You can always feel the return of the man who once broke you. Glay rode at the center. His coat was fine leather, his hat shadowing eyes too cold for the evening light. 2 men rode beside him, the kind that followed orders because they'd long since stopped listening to conscience. Jonas stood on the porch, boots planted, shoulders square. The horses slowed to a stop, their breath steaming in the cooling air. Glay dismounted like he owned the dirt beneath his feet. He pulled off his gloves, slow, deliberate, as though every motion was meant to remind the world of what he controlled. He called out that Jonas had something of his, claimed the law was on his side, that paper and ink made ownership holy. But Jonas didn't move, didn't blink. The space between them seemed to hold its breath. The last rays of sun cut across the ranch like fire, catching on the rifle barrel glinting in Jonas's hand. He said the law didn't mean a damn thing when the man behind it had no soul. The 2 riders moved first. They always do, muscle before mind. One lunged left, hand reaching for his revolver. Jonas swung the rifle stock hard, the wood cracking against the man's jaw with the sound of bone meeting truth. The second drew faster, but not fast enough. Jonas fired once, the blast echoing off the canyon walls, dust rising where the man fell. Glay froze. The gloves he'd been toying with slipped from his hands. The swagger drained out of him, leaving something smaller, something closer to what he truly was. Jonas stepped off the porch and crossed the dirt between them until he stood close enough that Glay could feel his breath. He told him to listen, and listen well, because if he ever set foot on this land again, the earth would remember his body before the law ever did. Glay's jaw tightened, but his eyes broke first. He turned back to his horse, pale, trembling, and rode off without another word. The dust swallowed him, leaving only silence behind. Evelyn stepped out after a long while. Her bare feet sank into the dirt where blood still marked the ground. She didn't look afraid anymore. Her eyes met Jonas's, and something in them had changed. Not trust, not yet, but something like it. Something that looked like the start of freedom. For the first time since that night she'd arrived, she wasn't running anymore. And Jonas, for the first time in years, felt that the world had given him something worth keeping. Days turned into weeks. The ranch settled into a quiet rhythm, the kind that only comes after chaos burns itself out. Evelyn began to smile again, small at first, cautious but real. She helped with chores, fed the chickens, patched torn shirts, and sat beside Jonas at dusk when the sky turned to gold. The 2 of them didn't talk much. They didn't have to. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. Then one morning the calm cracked. Evelyn didn't come out for breakfast. Jonas waited, then knocked softly on the tack room door. No answer. When he pushed it open, she was sitting on the edge of the cot, hands clasped over her stomach. The light through the window caught her face, pale and still. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. The truth hung between them like dust in sunlight. Jonas didn't ask who the father was. He already knew. The kind of knowledge that sits heavy and cold in a man's chest. He sat beside her in silence. The desert wind slipped through the open window, carrying the smell of sage and rain. Finally, she asked what she should do. Her voice was a whisper, as though she was asking the earth itself for mercy. Jonas rubbed his rough palms together and stared out at the horizon. He told her that she should let it live. She turned to him, eyes wide with disbelief. He didn't look back right away, just kept watching the light move across the ground. Even if it's his, he said, it still deserves to live. Her breath caught, trembling on the edge of hope and heartbreak. She waited for judgment, for anger, for pity, but none came. Jonas rose slowly, set his hat on the table and told her that she wasn't broken, just beginning again, that the child wouldn't carry the sins of its father, only what she chose to give it. Something inside her cracked then, not from pain, but from release. Her shoulders fell, her face found his chest, and he held her there, not as something fragile or damaged, but as something worth saving. From that day forward, the ranch wasn't silent anymore. The quiet was still there, but it was different now, full instead of hollow. Evelyn began to live, really live. She walked through the fields at dawn, her hand resting on the small curve of her belly, her hair unbound in the wind. Jonas fixed fences, mended roofs, kept watch at the edge of the property each night. Not out of fear, but out of promise. They started going into town together.
It wasn't easy at first.
The whispers followed them wherever they went. Small, cruel words from people who loved to judge what they couldn't understand. Evelyn kept her head high, and Jonas stayed beside her, silent but steady. In church, she sat in the front pew. In the general store, she bought baby blankets from the same counter Glay once swaggered past, his boots loud and proud. Now those boots didn't walk anywhere near her again. The months stretched on. The baby grew. The nights were longer but safer somehow. Jonas didn't speak of what happened that night, and she didn't either. Some things don't need to be told to be understood. When the baby finally came, the desert was quiet. The stars hung low and bright over the land. Jonas sat outside the door, listening to the sounds of new life in the world, the kind that mends what's been broken. When the crying stopped and Evelyn called for him, he stepped inside and found her holding the child, wrapped in one of his old flannel shirts. She was pale, exhausted, but glowing with something he hadn't seen before. Peace. Jonas looked at the child, small and warm, its tiny fingers curling in the air. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he laid his hand gently on the baby's head and said nothing more than what needed to be said in silence. The past was still there, but it didn't rule them anymore. In the weeks that followed, the ranch changed. Laughter began to replace echoes. The porch, once haunted by waiting, became a place of quiet evenings and soft lullabies. Evelyn grew stronger, and Jonas older, though softer in ways no one but her would ever notice. They never talked about Glay again. There was no need. Some ghosts die the moment you stop fearing them, and so the story of a lost girl and a quiet man became something different. Not perfect, not easy, but whole. Two souls that had no reason to believe in anything found faith in each other. In a world that threw people away like scraps, Jonas chose to hold on, even when it hurt. Especially then, because sometimes being a man isn't about the wars you fight. It's about the peace you choose to protect. And sometimes, the bravest thing a woman can do is learn to live again, even when her scars still remember the dark.